friends, welcome back to my channel. This is going to be a video about the rise of American thrifting, and oh my goodness, it just seems like thrifting is everywhere and it's popular. I go on YouTube and I see so many thrift hauls and I love them. I think they're awesome, but what has contributed to the rise in popularity in thrifting? This has been something that I've loved studying and I want to share with you guys in case you are also interested. If you like this type of content, please give it a like down below and let's just get right into the rise of American thrifting. If you don't know me, hi, my name is Leah. I am a full-time seller on Poshmark where I sell used clothing, and I will link my Poshmark closet link down in the description below. And let's just get right into this video. Now let's just go way back for a second, way back, and talk about how people used to make their own clothes, and that was pretty much the only way to get clothing, was to make your own. And I remember seeing videos and movies when I was little about prairie life and people making their own clothes, and then when those clothes wore out they would repurpose the clothes into something else, and that was pretty much the way of life for a lot of people. So now we're gonna jump ahead a little bit to the turn of the 19th century, about when clothing was becoming pretty popular to buy in stores. And it still wasn't that popular to mass-produce clothing at this time, but the Industrial Revolution had started, and the Industrial Revolution goes till about 1920. During the Industrial Revolution, where the option to use machines to make clothing allowed clothing to become mass-produced, and not even at a level where we recognize it, but at a level where you could go to a store and buy a garment of clothing that you don't have to make yourself.
I do my own sewing, and Mrs. Finster's on Charles Street carries silk pieces ready-made. Tomorrow I'll take you there.
In the 1800s you could still buy clothing, but it was more of tailored to fit your specific body measurements, and it wasn't on a mass production type of a scale. It was just more individual. In 1884, there wasn't too much mass production of clothing going on, but there was a stigma with used clothing that was either a hand-me-down from someone or maybe something that was acquired at a pawn shop, since pawn shops were available in 1884. It really wasn't a very good stigma. The May 3rd, 1884 Saturday Evening Post ran a story. It wasn't a true story, it was a satire, which means it was totally made up, but it did reflect the perspective people had about a girl who got a second-hand dress, and then the following days and weeks after, she developed smallpox from that dress that was second-hand. To sum it up, if you got something that was used or secondhand, you were probably looked down upon, so people didn't really talk about if they did get something secondhand. That pretty much just sums up the stigma associated with used clothing at that time. The whole process of the Industrial Revolution in America started back at the 18th century and is working its way up to about 1915. Around that time frame, the Industrial Revolution was coming to a close, and there was so much machinery that aided in the production of clothing that it was fairly popular to buy your clothing that was made and not necessarily tailored to your body shape, but you could just buy a size that was best for you and you didn't have to sew it. I'm gonna go back just a little bit and across the ocean to London, where a man named William Booth started a group called the Salvage Brigade. And he started this Salvage Brigade to give people work to do in exchange for food and shelter and clothing. And what this Salvage Brigade did was go out into the communities and look for items that families were casting off, whether that was old furniture or old things that weren't in use anymore, or even things that were destroyed in some way or another, and then they would bring them back and repair them, and in exchange for salvaging these items and repairing them, they would then sell these items after they were repaired, and these men in this Salvage Brigade would do this work in exchange for food, shelter, and clothing. That was in London. The Salvage Brigade became pretty popular in London, and they were also able to make income doing this salvage and repair work. And what's funny to me is that I see this is so popular even today. I see so many repair shops or restoration furniture businesses, and the pieces are absolutely beautiful. They're often better than anything you can find in the store, and I have a few friends who also do restoration furniture, and it's beautiful. This method became very popular in London, the Salvage Brigade, which then became known as the Salvation Army. And then in 1884, about 20 years later, the very first thrift store that was modeled after the Salvage Brigade stores in London was then opened in America. It wasn't a Salvation Army or a Salvage Brigade. It was just a thrift store that brought on that same model as the Salvation Army in London. And that was 1884, which seems like a crazy long time ago. The main items that this store sold were items that were cast off and then repaired. Anyways, jumping ahead about 20 more years, in 1904, Edgar Holmes launched the Goodwill, which was the same model as the Salvation Army in London, where they repaired cast off goods and sold them in their store, and then by repairing these items and selling them, they were able to offer people in the community work to do. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit closer to 2019, but we're still not there yet. We're still about 100 years away, so let's just make this fast. In the 1920s, these companies started to use the term thrift as a way to appeal to more housewives, because the term thrift tended to make one feel good about spending money or saving money. If you were thrifty, it had more of a good connotation to it than buying something that was a cast-off item, and the term thrift started to be more prevalent among different stores. In the 1930s, it was a little bit of a challenge for these stores to stay open, mostly because of the Great Depression, but in the 1930s, there were still donations and repairs that were being done and made for these stores. By the 1930s, there were 100 Goodwills nationwide. Jumping ahead to the 1950s, we are now in post-war, where the Industrial Revolution is over. People have clothing that they can buy. People want to buy colorful items. There's no more restriction on what you can buy from the war. That's all over, and people are buying an increased amount of clothing because they can and it's available. People were ready to redecorate their homes after the war, buy new clothing, and that means that they had to get rid of all of their old items, and they donated them to the Salvation Army, different thrift stores, charity shops, or Goodwills. So what's kind of interesting about the 1950s is that vintage clothing was a thing, and people in the 1950s liked the vintage clothing. So shopping at these stores also was trendy, and I know it seems like people were into vintage clothing in the 1950s. Like, 1950s is like extremely vintage today. But back then in the 1950s, maybe it was items from the 1920s that were trendy or cool to get from a thrift store, and people were going to these stores to look for vintage clothing, and that was in the 1950s. 1960s brought in a lot of hippies, and hippies also love thrift shopping. I don't want to categorize everyone in this category, all hippies, but as a general rule, it seemed like it was pretty popular among hippies to buy their clothing from the different thrift stores. And then over the next 50 years, consumerism just skyrocketed as people were able to afford more items and buy items new from the stores, and they accumulated more items in their home. As people purged their home to make way for new items, they would donate them to the thrift store, and it just became a cycle of buying more, getting rid of stuff, buying more, getting rid of stuff. And this past decade, oh my goodness, what contributed to this rise really recently in the popularity of thrifting. Now, I know thrifting has been somewhat popular among different people and families and groups over the past 100 years, but over the past 10 years, it seems like it has just grown exponentially, where it's just become really mainstream to go thrifting and even trendy and cool. Why is that? When 140 years ago, it was very much looked down upon, but today it is almost esteemed as something that is cool and trendy. Some of these things you might have guessed I was going to say, but some of them maybe not. I think a lot of different things contributed to the culture in America with thrifting and the popularity of thrifting today. And the first thing, going back to 2008, in my opinion, I think that made thrifting kind of like a unique, cool type of thing to do was when the Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants came out. And this is just a little bit of a theory. When the Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants came out, so many of us who watched that movie thought, oh my goodness, Blake Lively found a pair of jeans at a thrift store and she was rocking them, and I want to be just like Blake Lively, so I'm gonna go to the thrift store and I'm gonna find a pair of pants or something that is unique and cool and special and looks good on me, and I'm just gonna rock it. That's just my own personal theory. Macklemore's song Thrift Shop came out in 2012, which hit the top 100 list a few different times, and I just remember hearing that song everywhere. And in that song, he talks about getting a coat from the thrift store for only 99 cents. And because that song was so popular, I think it just kind of ingrained in a lot of people that the thrift store is an option to find good items. And then in 2014, the book Girl Boss came out, which was written by Sophia Amoruso, who started Nasty Gal, but before she started her clothing company, she started selling vintage clothing on eBay and selling it, and as soon as she would list items, they sold, and she would thrift shop and sell these clothes on eBay and just sell out every time that she listed items on eBay. And that led her to start her own clothing line, which was Nasty Gal. And then she wrote the book Girl Boss, and in 2014 that book was everywhere and people were talking about this book and talking about her business model and how she was able to shop at thrift stores and resell the clothes online and eventually start her own company. One of the final items I think that really solidified thrifting as a valuable lifestyle and way to buy clothing was the documentary that came out called The True Cost. And I know a lot of you have probably seen The True Cost. It's a free film, free documentary on Netflix where it documents the lifestyle of these workers overseas and how clothing companies can sell clothes for $3 or $4 for a shirt or $9 or $10 for a pair of pants and make money on it, because it doesn't seem viable that a company could sell a shirt for $3. But the living conditions and the wages that they pay people in these other countries is so low and so pathetic that this company is able to make profit on just a $3 or $4 shirt. That documentary became really powerful in showing people what consumerism and mainstream low-cost fashion contributes to the economy in other countries and the lifestyle in other countries, and it allows us to think as a nation, where did my clothing come from, or why was this shirt only $3, and what's the condition of the facility that these clothes are being made in, and it's usually really horrible. All of those things contributed to esteeming the thrift shop industry and the thrift shopping that people do. And people tend to change their mindset when culture as a whole starts to esteem something rather than look down on it. With that, thrift shopping does have a sense of what treasure am I going to find, and people get addicted to finding things because there are so many things to find in a thrift store that are good items. And then you see all these hauls on YouTube of people thrift shopping and finding really cool items. And I also think another contributing factor to the rise of thrifting is the recent rise of vintage fashion and 90s fashion and that trend. I was looking on Urban Outfitters website and so many of the clothes looked like something that was from the 90s. I found this pair of Guess shorts that I could almost promise you I could find at a thrift store because they're so vintage looking, and at Urban Outfitters I think they were like $80 or $90, but when you go to a thrift store you could find something from the 90s and it could just be $5. Kind of what's in style, I think, contributes a lot too, because the vintage look is kind of like the look that you'll find in a thrift store anyways. A couple last things I want to mention is that there are over 25,000 thrift stores in America as of 2018. So that is a lot. And I also was looking up the Google search for the popularity and trends in searching for thrift stores, and oh my goodness, the rise in popularity in just Googling thrift stores near me has also skyrocketed. People are looking for thrift stores near them quite often, and I think it's mostly in California. I'm going to link a couple other resources down below if this is a topic that you're interested in researching a little bit more. That is pretty much everything I have to say about the rise in popularity in American thrifting. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time. Bye!